of time to spare. Plenty of time, time will tell. In for a penny, in for a pound. Keep some spirits earth, but it's not to cry. Little bird told me, slowly birds slowly. I live on the branches and kisses. Oh, 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 oh. In for a penny, in for a pound. Keep some spirits earth, but it's not to cry. All things come to.
In this episode, we sail from mainland Cornwall to the Isles of Scilly. These beautiful islands are like a tropical paradise off the south coast of England, except with British weather. For those of you who read our blog, you'll know there was quite a bit of drama during our stay in the Isles of Scilly. But before we get into that, we'll show you some of the work we've done to Kittiwake. When we bought her in August 2016, Kittiwake was set up as a weekend boat, so there was a fair amount of work to turn her into a livable sail cruiser. We replaced all the rigging, the wires that run from the boat to the top of the mast. Some of the winches couldn't even turn, so we stripped them, bristled them and rebuilt them. We serviced both engines and installed much beefier anchoring gear as we spent most nights on the hook. We stripped the existing pressurised water system and replaced it with manual foot pumps to save on both water and energy. We installed 4 big solar panels on the boat and put in 2 huge 6-volt batteries. We gave the interior a makeover with a new table, new cushion covers and converting the 2 sofas into a U-settee. We rebedded the windows and replaced 2 of them. We also replaced all of the interior wall covering. This turned out to be the worst job, as we had to scrape a load of glue off the fiberglass, which showered us and the boat with glass fibers. There were 100 other little things that took up a lot of time, but we loved the process of making Kittiwake ours and turning this weekend sailor into the comfortable cruiser she was meant to be.
From Falmouth, where we bought the boat, we headed down to the Helford River to chill out for a couple of days before sailing to the Isles of Scilly. Isles of Scilly from Helford River is about 60 miles, which takes about 14 hours, and we left in the evening so that we'd sail overnight and arrive in daylight. We weren't really too sure how fast Kittiwake would go because we're still learning about her, so we wanted to give ourselves plenty of time. But it'll be our first night passage, and it was great, especially at first. There was a really nice sunset, there was a starry night and lots of bioluminescence. But after a few hours, Eleanor started feeling a bit unwell and went to bed. So I hand steered most of the way, which it was tiring, but it wasn't really unpleasant because the wind and the seas were from behind, and we made good time and arrived at lunchtime. After a few days on the islands, we saw in the forecast that there was a 40-mile-an-hour gale coming, so we researched the best spot to wait it out. The winds were forecast to come from the southwest, so all the resources said that Watermill Cove would be the best place to go, and anchorage on the north side of St Mary's. We arrived there a couple of days early, sailed round from St Mary's Harbour, which was really nice, and we dug the anchor in under engine and rigged a bridle, which distributes the load between 3 cleats rather than it all being on one. We enjoyed a couple of days in the sunshine and explored the area.
So we're on St Mary's on one of the burial chambers. There's meant to be about 80 or more burial chambers from the Neolithic period in the Scilly Isles, and it's thought that back then the sea level was much lower and a lot of the islands were connected at low tide.
The evening before the winds were forecast to start, we got Marika on deck and tied her down and got everything cleared from the outside of the boat. And 3 French boats arrived, 2 of which rafted up next to each other and started to have a party. And then the 3rd French boat anchored almost on top of our anchor, and then realised their mistake and moved about 10 metres away from our anchor. We weren't really very happy about it, so we kept a close eye on them. The next morning we got up to see one of the party boats re-anchoring. They had a lot of seaweed on their anchor when they pulled it up, so I assume they'd dragged their anchor. And Eleanor asked the boat nearest to us how much chain they had out, and they said they had 40 metres. And we were anchored in about 10 metres of water, so that was a scope of about 1 in 4. Eleanor asked them to put out more because they were anchored right behind us at this point. We'd swung round, so they were right behind us, and we wanted to increase our scope. We had about 50 metres out, and we wanted to increase it to about 70 metres really because the winds had piped up.
The wind was quite strong, but the waves weren't that big because we were well protected from the land. So after lunch we went to bed to watch a movie, as the wind was quite calm. It didn't even feel that rolly at all. But just as the movie ended, the wind picked up and it was stronger than ever. We went out on deck to find out that the boat that had re-anchored in the morning had been dragging. And this is because the wind had shifted north of northwest against all forecasts, and the waves were coming directly into the cove. We expected someone to jump on deck and just drag the boat away, but we soon realised that there was no dinghy at the back of the boat, and the other party boat as well didn't have a dinghy at the back. We saw both dinghies on the shore, and the second party boat, which wasn't dragging, had 3 people on board. In less than a minute, the yacht that was dragging was all the way on the other side of the cove and was almost on some rocks. The other party boat was left with no dinghy, so they tried to quickly pull up their anchor to try and go and save the yacht, but it was way too late. By this point, the boat was on the rocks and we could see waves crashing on it. So we turned on the radio and listened in on channel 16, but no one was speaking, so there was no way of knowing whether anyone had called for help yet. So we tried to call the other boats on the radio many times, both in English and French, as best as I could, but no one replied. So in the end I waved to the party boat that was going around the cove by this point, not being anchored, and asked them if they called the coastguard, and they simply shook their heads. By this point, the crew of the grounded boat had come back and found the boat on the rocks, so they tried to get as close as possible to the boat by climbing on some rocks, and one of the men managed to get on board and was walking around on the decks. We decided to issue a Mayday Relay, so Ryan went down below and got on the radio, whilst I kept watch and relayed information back to him as Falmouth Coast Guard asked questions. At this point, the French boat that was anchored too close to us started dragging, and they soon became very, very close to us. I didn't have time to react, but the captain managed to drive it away right on time. I went back to my duties, so stayed in the cockpit and kept watch on all the boats and relayed information to Ryan, but just a few minutes later their boat dragged again, and this time their bow was headed for our helm, so that's exactly where I was. The woman on board started screaming to me to move away, which I obviously couldn't do because we were very tight on our anchor with the strong winds, which at this point were over 50 miles per hour. And she kept on waving to me to go backwards, which I obviously couldn't do, so I did the best I could. I engaged the engine and went forward into port, and that, coupled with the action of the captain driving away, managed to avoid the collision by just a few meters. It was really scary, but thankfully no one got hurt and both boats were completely fine. They then motored away and tried to get somewhere safer.
The lifeboat and land-based coastguard crews turned up at the scene really quickly, and they stopped the boat's crew from getting back on board the boat. Lines were attached to the base of the mast, and the lifeboat backed down on them to try and pull the boat off the rocks. That didn't work, and suddenly the lifeboat just shot off back towards St Mary's. We were a bit confused by that. But we later learned that one of the lifeboat men had his foot trapped by one of the ropes pulling the boat off, and he had to be evacuated really quickly to hospital. Our anchor held firm during all this time, but now with the waves coming directly into the cove, we decided to leave and head round in the lee of St Mary's Island to shelter in Porth Cressa. We wouldn't be able to pick up our anchor because the bows of Kittiwake were rising and falling really sharply in the steep seas, so we tied a couple of fenders to the anchor road and slipped it, just let it go into the sea, and we'd have to come back and collect it later. We headed around the island towards Porth Cressa, but with the winds gusting over 60 miles per hour, we struggled to make any way into the winds, and with the light fading, we decided to call for a tow into port. Thankfully, the harbour master came out with the powerful rib and towed us onto a mooring ball. The French boat was holed in multiple places and sank on the next rising tide.
Being new to cruising, we weren't really expecting to witness an incident like this. It was a frightening experience, and we spent a long time reflecting on the fact that us calling the Coast Guard led to a lifeboat man losing his foot. The best thing we can do, though, is to learn from this accident. We dig in the anchor with our engine every time that we anchor, and we don't leave the boat for at least an hour after a successful anchoring. We never leave the boat unattended in high winds, and we're a lot more cautious about cruising in places where there's limited options for anchoring in heavy weather. The most important lesson, though, is that when we're sailing, our actions impact on more people than ourselves, including those who are willing to risk their lives to correct our mistakes.
We spent a total of 3 weeks in the Isles of Scilly, and after all this drama, went and relaxed in some of the beautiful anchorages.
Now I can see the sky, now I can see a ray of light. After all the rain, after all the tears we cried, against the water, against the mud, we have to fight. We're always ready, all for one when someone dies. Across the streets, across the city, the dirty river runs wide. Across the streets, across the city, the dirty river runs wide. People working hard.
Thanks for watching this episode of Sailing Kittiwake. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe in the box down below. Tune in next time when we'll sail across the English Channel to France and continue our adventure on the continent. If you'd like to support our video production, we're now on Patreon.